Good afternoon and a warm welcome to our viewing public and members of the media. Thank you all for joining us. I am Kavita Supram, Corporate Communications Officer at the Ministry of Finance. Today, the Honorable Minister of Finance will be addressing matters arising out of the IMF 2023 Article 4 consultation with Trinidad and Tobago. We will be taking questions from the media later on, so without further ado, I will now pass you over to the Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Kavita. I'd like to start this press conference by a slide presentation which goes through the concluding statement of the consultations between the International Monetary Fund and Trinidad and Tobago in respect of Article 4 of the IMF agreement. Now, before we do that, I thought it was necessary to have this press conference, and we thought so, because over the last couple of weeks, there has been a lot of misinformation in the media with respect to exactly what the IMF said. And what has happened, instead of proper reporting on the entire statement, elements have cherry-picked certain things which are of interest to them, or perhaps what they consider to be negative, and highlighted those. I firmly believe that if this staff concluding statement was overwhelmingly negative, it would have received coverage in the media for a month. But because it is overwhelmingly positive, it seems not to be newsworthy. So I would like now to go through the actual IMF statement part by part. So let's start with the first part.
For some reason it's not connected. Just lost connection, Minister.
Connection with what?
Zoom, the actual Zoom itself, we just lost connection.
So I am now blank.
No, you are still live. You are still live. The Zoom connection for the presentation is down.
As soon as you're ready. We seem to be having some technical difficulties. Kavita, perhaps you could take me off screen. You could take me off screen and mute me for now until we get this back. They can see, but they can't. So, first one. All right. The first slide has a very positive headline. Economic activity is recovering. And in this slide, the IMF says in its statement that they are estimating that real GDP expanded by 2.5% in 2022. Now, the government's estimate was 2.0%. And in fact, the IMF team told me they felt slightly embarrassed because, the world view of the IMF is that they are the bad boys. So for them to come and say that they estimate that the real GDP, the growth in GDP, was more than the government estimated officially, was a little disconcerting for them, but these are the facts. The IMF has estimated that real GDP expanded by 2.5% in 2022, and that they expect, as we go on to the next slide.
Recording in progress.
We go to the next slide, right. They expect that there will be a decline in government debt. Look at this slide, for example. Central government debt declined to 53.8% of GDP, and gross public sector debt declined from 71% to 71% of GDP from 79.2% of GDP in the previous year. So what the IMF is saying here is that our debt to GDP ratio, total debt to GDP ratio, which includes all government guaranteed debt, loans to state enterprises and so on, declined by almost 9% year on year from last year to this year. And that our financial buffers remain very strong, with the HSF at $5 billion US. If you go to the next slide, this is what I was referring to. The recovery is expected to gain broad-based momentum in 2023 with a 3.2 GDP expansion. We in the Ministry of Finance, we haven't finalized our estimates of what is going to happen in 2023. If we do in fact get a 3% GDP expansion, we'll be very pleased, because it will show that our efforts to build in sustainable growth in the economy are working. And you will also note from this slide that the IMF is saying that inflation is projected to slow down from the 8.7% that it reached in December of 22 to 4.5% by the end of 2023. And they expect, because of our policies, and I will explain that later, that inflation will continue to decline with international prices. They do note that we should have a narrow current account surplus because of waning gas and petrochemical prices. We go to 4. The fiscal position is expected to swing from surplus in financial year 22 to a deficit in 2023, and then stabilize at moderate deficits over the medium term. We had estimated that our deficit this year would be 1%. We estimated that back in September. They are saying they think it'll be closer to 2.8%. And they have made the point, and I think it's important to note this comment, that the deficit is expected to persist over the medium term, which could widen with the outcome over the ongoing public sector wage negotiations. So the IMF has zeroed in on the fact that if we are not prudent with public sector wage negotiations, we could have a widening fiscal deficit. They expect that whatever the outcome, that we will be within our soft debt target of 75% of GDP. Let's go to 5. I saw a commentator make heavy weather of this one, that the balance of risks to growth is tilted to the downside. But if one reads the narrative, it has very little to do with us in Trinidad and Tobago, because it speaks to a sharper than expected global slowdown, which will affect energy markets and global financial instabilities. And the IMF wrote this before you had the problem with Credit Suisse, for example. So that these are things that are outside of our control as a country. A global slowdown, the price of oil and gas, and problems in the international financial markets. We can't control that at all. But on the upside, there's potential for higher than expected energy production and prices, including from a new U.S. license to Trinidad and Tobago to develop a major gas field in Venezuela. So the downside risks they're talking about are the risks outside of our control, and we will do whatever we can within our control. Let's go to 6. This is a very positive endorsement from the IMF. Staff welcomes the authority's prudent management of the energy revenue windfall and underscores the importance to continue rebuilding buffers. And in this, the IMF has underscored the fact that we put 345 million US dollars, 1.3% of GDP, into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund in 2022. They've also said that we're avoiding pro-cyclical spending and we're rebuilding fiscal buffers. So we are not falling victim to what the economists call the Dutch disease, that you get an energy windfall and you just blow it and you throw it away. They have seen that we are not doing that, and we are being very prudent and careful. When one goes to 7, the IMF is of the view that the envisaged expenditure envelope in the fiscal 23 budget is appropriate, particularly considering the capital expenditure needs. Now, in this fiscal, we increased the allocation for the capital program up to in excess of $6 billion. And this has found favor with the IMF and we found favor with most agencies, including the rating agencies, because it will spend money on infrastructure and on projects and programs and will boost economic activity and also create employment. The IMF has also noted that we have taken the decision to partially liberalize fuel prices, and they have told us to continue providing targeted and temporary support to alleviate the rising living costs among the most vulnerable. And that means that they recognize that we are doing that, and they're asking us to continue to do that. Go to 8. The authority's commitment to balance the budget over the medium term is prudent and welcome. So, and they advise us to implement tax reforms, strengthen tax administration, gradually phase out subsidies, and improve public spending efficiency, all of which we have been doing for the last 7 years. And we've been doing it without being part of an IMF program, and I will talk about that at the end of this presentation. Let's go to 9. This is obvious. Long-term fiscal risks related to the pension system and the global energy transition away from fossil fuels need to be addressed. We in Trinidad and Tobago, we're not sleeping. We have been looking at our national insurance system, and the IMF has made the point, which I agree is absolutely correct, that in the absence of reforms, our national insurance system's deficit is expected to widen and is reserved to be depleted by the mid-2030s. And that is why they welcome our proposal to increase the retirement age to 65 years, which is still at the proposal stage. We are still looking at that. And other ways of boosting the national insurance system, the NIS fund, to make sure that there's sufficient money there to pay retirement benefits for the foreseeable future. So they've told us to take a look at increasing the contribution rate, and that we have always said is a last resort. We are looking at it now to see whether it makes sense, but we are also looking at increasing the retirement age to 65 years. So the IMF is saying, look, you need to have a transition away from energy in due course, and I mean, that is obvious. So let's go to 10. Enhancing the fiscal policy framework would help strengthen planning and reinforce fiscal sustainability. What this means is that they are asking us to look at legislating fiscal rules. In other words, legislate how much money you can spend and so on. We have never done that as a country. And certainly during COVID, many countries that have fiscal rules into their laws found themselves in deep trouble, having to either amend those fiscal rules or to just breach them. Because in COVID, there's no way you could run a fiscal surplus, for example. I'll give you an example. Jamaica, for example, which had been in an IMF program for many years, over 40 years, had been asked by the IMF, in order to get money from the IMF, to post a fiscal surplus every year, 5 or 7%. And you can imagine if you have to post a fiscal surplus in Trinidad and Tobago as a as a part of uh, rigid policy. Let's say we had to post a fiscal surplus of 5% of GDP every year. That would mean we would have to post a surplus of $10 billion, which would mean that we would have to spend 10 billion less than we earn. So that would cause such havoc to the Trinidad and Tobago economy and our standard of living that is not something that we are going to do. But we have asked the IMF to take a look at the way we approach fiscal matters, because we do have informal fiscal rules. We try our best to balance our budget, we try our best to be prudent, and therefore we will ask them to look at draft fiscal rules so we could take a look at them, not saying that we would adopt them. If we go to 11, this is an interesting. The IMF encourages the authorities to continue maintaining sound and consistent policies to support the current exchange rate arrangement. So what are they saying? When they tell you to continue, they mean you're doing it. So as far as they are concerned, we have sound and consistent policies. They spoke about the repo rate, and I noticed a commentator jumped on that the fact that the central bank has maintained its repo rate at 3.5% since 2020 to support the recovery of the economy. They are asking the country, the central bank in particular, to seriously consider increasing the policy rate to contain inflation pressures and to narrow interest rate differentials with the US monetary policy rate. But in our meeting with the IMF, and the governor was part of our team, he made the point that unlike the Federal Reserve, which has a legal mandate to use interest rates to contain inflation, we have no such mandate in Trinidad and Tobago. Our central bank looks at all sorts of things, looks at economic growth, looks at credit to businesses, looks at the rate of unemployment, and makes a very careful decision with respect to the repo rate in terms of maintaining it at 3.5%, because simply the central bank doesn't want to crash the economy. Look at what's going on in the United States. The Federal Reserve, because it has this narrow straitjacket that it must use interest rates to contain inflation. So the Federal Reserve looks at inflation, it's going up. So they increase interest rates to suppress inflation. But what that does, it suppresses economic growth, it suppresses employment, and look at what it did to the banks. Because the Federal Reserve just kept increasing interest rates over and over and over, banks in the United States got into trouble. They couldn't cope with those increased interest rates. So it's easy to be superficial when you see something like this. But I want to commend the central bank, and I agree with their policy, that when we look at interest rates, you must not just be narrowly focused on inflation, but we must also look at GDP, we must look at employment, and we must look at economic activity, which is what they do. They use a very broad-based approach. They are not confined to just increasing interest rates to try and bring inflation down. And when the governor made that point to the IMF, they completely understood it. And ironically, this was before Credit Suisse ran into trouble. And Credit Suisse ran into trouble because of that, because of increasing interest rates. We go now to 12. A more efficient forex infrastructure would help eliminate forex shortfalls. One of the commentators jumped on this with glee and gave us a big, screaming front-page headline, insinuating that the IMF wants us to free up the dollar, leading to devaluation. Look at what the IMF is saying here, and it brings me to my point. Trinidad and Tobago is not in an IMF program. We have not been in an IMF program for over 30 years. The last time we were in an IMF program was in the 1986 to 1991 period. And we all know what went on there. They cut public servant salaries, take away COLA, retrenched people, etc., because they had to follow the dictates of the IMF. So many people lost their jobs, they lost their house, all sorts of things. People had to leave the country because of the negative conditionalities associated with that IMF program 30 years ago. But we are not in an IMF program, and it is unlikely we will ever get into an IMF program, at least not under this government. So therefore, when we have the Article 4 consultation with the IMF, it is simply part of the agreement that we as a country have with the IMF. Countries agree. Every country that is a member of the IMF agrees under Article 4 of the Articles Agreement with the IMF that the IMF can exercise surveillance over the economic, financial, and exchange policies of Trinidad and Tobago in order to ensure that the country can make an appropriate contribution to the effective operation of the international monetary system. So when you join the IMF, you agree that every year or every 18 months or so, there is a consultation with the IMF and the country, between the two of them, on your economic situation pursuant to Article 4 of the Articles Agreement. But because we are not in an IMF program, we don't have to agree with anything that the IMF advises us to do. And we don't agree with this. And I want to repeat that for 7 years, this government has resisted any calls from any sector to devalue the dollar or to float the dollar, because we believe that is going to send hundreds of thousands of people into poverty. We believe it will cause hyperinflation, and we believe that it will do tremendous damage. So when the IMF says that they encourage the authorities to remove all restrictions on current international transactions, we don't do that. That is why we came up with our Exim Bank facility, where we provide foreign exchange for importers of essential foods, flour, rice, cheese, all of the essentials that we import as a country, chicken and so on. We provide foreign exchange to the Exim Bank to provide that foreign exchange to importers of essential foods and essential items like pharmaceuticals, medication, and so on. Another window at the Exim Bank is provision of foreign exchange to manufacturers who would manufacture and produce. And you will have seen over the weekend, there was an excellent article in one of the newspapers where the CEO of the Exim Bank was interviewed, and he confirmed what I have been saying, that when you do the maths and you check the records, you discover that the companies in the manufacturing sector who have been given foreign exchange through the Exim Bank facility are in fact repatriating more foreign exchange than they are being given, which means the system is working, and it is working extremely well. We will continue to boost that system. We will expand it. We will expand it to other categories that are in the public interest. We will put more money into the Exim Bank and so on, so that our foreign exchange is focused on creating jobs and on boosting exports, and also dealing with the import of essential items. But what we not do is this, where they say remove all restrictions on current international transactions. We shall not be pumping US dollars into the system for people to buy townhouses in Miami, which is what is the end result of this. 13, the authorities need to remain vigilant to potential vulnerabilities in the financial system. Of course, central bank has been doing an excellent job, and this is why they can say the system is sound and resilient, but has potential vulnerabilities. Let's go to 14, and this came up in the parliament recently, and the IMF has said this: they welcome the progress towards enhancing the resilience of the banking and insurance sectors in line with the recommendations of the 2020 Financial System Stability Assessment. So the central bank has a program, and they're working actively on implementing all of the recommendations of the Financial System Stability Assessment. in order to continue to make our financial sector as robust as it possibly can be. Go to 15. IMF has recognized that we are actively embracing fintech for financial inclusion and development, and also working on mitigating the risks of digitization. Go to 16. IMF staff welcomes the authority's progress to enhance the financial integrity and international tax transparency frameworks. We have shared with them what we're doing with the Global Forum and the EU, and they are very encouraged as to what we have in mind. When you go to 17 now, this is obvious. We have to step up our efforts to secure economic transformation. They recognize the energy sector will remain the country's main growth engine, but they are welcoming our efforts to take advantage of existing petrochemical infrastructure to transition into clean energy, and they make the point, of course, there is scope to diversify export products and markets. 18, again, this is obvious. The economic diversification process requires supporting policies to address structural bottlenecks. And the point they have made is that digitization will go a long way towards helping the ease of doing business and allow the government to deliver more efficient public services and enhance the social safety net. Go to 19, they're commending us on our work in terms of our solar energy projects and our move towards the production of green hydrogen. We're well ahead of many other countries in the world, many other developing countries where that is concerned. And then 20, this underscores the point that I have been making. The IMF welcomes the progress to improve the quality, timeliness, and coverage of macroeconomic statistics, so that they have confirmed my view that the CSO's publication of data has improved tremendously over the last several years. So those are the 20 points that the IMF made. And I dare say 17 of these 20 points can be viewed as overwhelmingly positive. And 3 are simply comments and advice coming from the IMF. So I will now open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Minister. At this point in time, we have no questions from the media.
Seriously? Well, I'll wait.
Media representatives are kindly asked to utilize the raise hand tool to ask your questions.
Afternoon, Kunchanta of Newsday. Minister, given what you just said, 2 questions that I have. First of all, given the objectives that the government has outlined in terms of strengthening, diversifying the economy and what the IMF has said, where does efficient public procurement factor into all of that, and how was that office working at this time? And secondly, given, as you're saying, what the IMF has come back to you, and it seemed to resonate a lot with what the government is doing, does this give you any type of thinking as to the format of what could be presented in the mid-year review?
Well, certainly this IMF report would give a sort of a window into what could be presented in the mid-year review, because this is very recent. So the IMF was here during the month of March, February and March, actually just around Carnival time. And therefore, their report is several months after the presentation of the budget back in September. So their report is quite close to the mid-year review. So quite a lot of what they are saying would give you a window into what's happening and what will happen in the mid-year review. But no, it's not everything. The mid-year review will be far more focused. I'll be reporting on income and expenditure. I'll be looking at trends. I'll be looking at what we think the fiscal outturn would be, and also giving a report of some kind on progress being made in certain key areas like the Revenue Authority and things like that. But I suggest you wait until the mid-year review. I'm looking at end of April, first week in May for the mid-year review. So it's not going to be long, it's just a month or so from now. But with respect to procurement, the Prime Minister has given a commitment to proclaim the legislation by Easter, and Easter isn't far away. So I suggest you just wait.
Thank you, Clint. And you move on to our next question.
Minister Humbert Curtis Williams here from the Express newspaper, CCN. First of all, do you think that when people hear you say that the downside risks are really out of the government's control, but at the same time you thump your chest when prices are high, that there seems to be a kind of two-faced approach to reporting to the country, where if things are bad, it's the international situation, but if those same prices are good, then it's really your performance. Do you think that sometimes sends the wrong message to the country? And the second question I want to ask you is, it's clear that we've seen in the last 3 months significant fall off in LNG prices globally. The GFC, there was a report in this weekend's newspaper that shows as much as 40 to 50% fall off globally in LNG prices, significant fall in petrochemical prices. To what extent have your revenue streams been negatively impacted by those things?
Okay, let me correct you first, Curtis. I made it crystal clear before. I'm making it today, and I'll make this point in the future. Have we lost Curtis?
No,
He's still there?
he's muted.
Okay,
Just
yeah,
allow him to
just
answer.
not seeing it. Right. I've made it crystal clear before that when you go into the economic fundamentals, if you look very closely at the data from the Central Statistical Office, and if you even go and look at what the IMF is saying, that the outturn in fiscal 2022 was not only due to enhanced oil and gas prices. And in fact, the non-oil sector rebounded much better than the energy sector, so that our success last year was due from 2 sources. Of course, the unexpectedly high prices of oil and gas helped to boost the coffers in the treasury. Of course, that goes without saying. But when you dig into the numbers and you see the growth in the non-oil sector, you see the growth in exports, non-energy exports, averaging 20% in fiscal 2022, it is not correct to say that when things went well last year, it was because of external factors. It was not. It was a combination of external factors and internal factors. And in fact, I am very encouraged by what I'm seeing in the data coming out from the CSO. When I look at industry by industry, I'm very encouraged because I'm seeing that our economy has rebounded from the ravages of COVID. I'm seeing that our manufacturing sector has taken up the challenge and is growing at a tremendous rate. I'm seeing that exports in the non-energy sector are growing, and therefore our diversification strategies are working. With respect to the second part, and I always find it interesting the way the media puts things across. When something is bad, they say so-and-so said. When something is good, they say the minister boasted or he thumped his chest, as you said. We simply state facts. When they're bad, they're bad. When they're good, they're good. We don't boast. But I mean, that seems to be a word that is used frequently by the media to kind of discredit good news. Let me go to the second point. Yes, we have some issues in terms of revenue. I will account to the country at the time of the mid-year review. Yes, I have some concerns about revenue targets and so on. Obviously, we can all read, we all see the international press and so on. We get data all the time on a daily basis in terms of the price of WTI, the price of Brent, the price of natural gas. But I want to make a point, and I've made it before, that Trinidad and Tobago benefits from a revised formula for revenue from the natural gas sector in particular, where the prices that we get for tax and revenue purposes are not based simply on Henry Hub. They are now based on 3 benchmarks. The Henry Hub is the United States benchmark. The NBP, which is the British natural gas benchmark, and the JKM, which is the Japan Korea benchmark. And if one goes and checks, while you may see Henry Hub at $2, you might see NBP at $15 and JKM at $16. So that the net back prices that we get for gas are not based on Henry Hub. So when I speak in the budget, my figure that I give of $6 is a net back price. So we also have a different formula for LNG net back gas prices and a different one for petrochemical net back prices. The petrochemical net back price is based on the prices of the commodities, the price of ammonia, the price of methanol, the price of urea, etc. So as these prices are high, we get a high net back price for revenue purposes from the petrochemical sector. And as the JKM and the NBP prices continue to be elevated, it is helping us tremendously in terms of dealing with the issues with respect to the extremely low and unanticipated Henry Hub price. And I can tell you that for the first 4 years of the fiscal, the net back price for gas was above the budget estimates. As we move in now to the latter part of the fiscal, it's coming a little below. So the average for the last 6 months or so is turning out to be close to the budget estimates for gas. Oil, of course, is lower than before. And as the IMF have said, we make adjustments, we are prudent, we are careful, we are sensible, and we will manage accordingly.
We move on to our next question.
Good afternoon, Minister. Good afternoon, colleagues. This is Anthony Wilson from Guardian Media Limited. Minister, I have two questions for you. You and Prime Minister Keith Christopher Rowley were members of the 1991 to 95 cabinet. Next month is the 30th anniversary of the flotation of the TT dollar in April 1993. From your recollection, can you tell us and the nation whether there was skyrocketing inflation following the 1993 April flotation, skyrocketing inflation and a recession following that event?
That's question one, and what about question two?
Question two goes back to, I believe, point 6 of the IMF concluding statement, in which they welcomed the decision to partially liberalize fuel prices. Given where the price of oil, Brent, and West Texas is now, would the country benefit from a full liberalization of fuel prices at this time?
Okay, I'll answer question two first. Oil prices are so volatile that one has to look at them for a suitable period of time, because you could be at $100 today and next week at $75. So we are monitoring the price of oil to see how it affects the fuel subsidy, and we'll make an appropriate decision at an appropriate time. But you can't just jump because you see today it is 75, because 2 months ago it was 95. So one has to be careful. One can't make a knee-jerk reaction. I was struggling to figure out what one of these 20 points, your first question was. Could you help me there?
Okay.
First question,
Anthony,
which one of the
your first
20
question?
which one of the 20 points in the IMF concluding statement was your first question, which went back 30 years? Relevant to
maybe point 11, which advised the government to remove the restrictions on current international transactions.
Okay.
So in response to the Guardian's publication of that element of the concluding statement, you said in a tweet that if the government were to take that advice, there would be skyrocketing inflation and a recession. I'm asking you, in the context of April 1993, the flotation of the TT dollar, was there skyrocketing inflation and a recession following that event?
The simple answer to that is yes, but that's not the point. We are now in 2023. I can't look at what went on 30 years ago and construct a hypothetical scenario. I am telling you, I'm not asking you that if we were to devalue the dollar to 10 to 1, for example, which would be a 50% devaluation or a 40% devaluation, you'd have an immediate increase in the cost of imported goods, and you'd have immediate demands from the labor unions, which would be very difficult to challenge, that they would demand increased wages, which itself would have a cyclical effect and a domino effect on inflation. So I don't think it's a serious question. I think any serious person will know that if we devalue the dollar, there would be significant inflation and it would send our people into poverty. I don't think you need to do the maths for that, but if you would like me to do a mathematical calculation as to what the estimated inflation would be if we did a devaluation of the dollar by 40 or 50%, I will ask the central bank to do that for me, and I will share it with you. But I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that if you devalue the dollar significantly, because we have such a high import bill, because so many manufactured goods come from abroad, so much of our food comes from abroad, and also you would have demands from the labor unions that there would be an immediate increase, inflationary increase that would be unsustainable. So I don't think we need to debate this point. So could we go to the next question, please?
Our next question from
Hi,
Curtis.
Minister. Just trying to follow a little bit.
Oh, hold on, Curtis. Do we have nobody else? Okay, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So tell me something. The IMF is predicting a 3%. The surplus at 0.3 of a percentage point. I think you had said in the budget, or you had said in a tweet or something about 0.6% of GDP.
What exact? Which surplus? Hold on, Curtis.
2022.
Which surplus? You're talking about fiscal surplus, current account surplus?
Fiscal surplus.
Yes, the IMF does a different calculation of the way they look at surpluses and income and expenditure and so on. They look at one-off infusions of income as something not to be taken into account in the calculation. So when the IMF does its calculation of our surplus, you could bet your bottom dollar that is the most conservative assessment possible. And what's good about that is that even though the IMF would have taken out any one-off revenue might have got from CLICO, for example, or some other one-off source of revenue, in other words, it's not a continuing source of revenue, if they took that out from our total revenue envelope, and they did so, even so, we still had a fiscal surplus in 2022, which is, to me, quite commendable.
Any more questions? Please utilize the raise hand so that we know you have a question.
Yeah, I actually had two questions, and I didn't get a chance to ask the second. The second question.
That brings you up to 4 now, eh? You realize that?
Yeah, that's why we must have face-to-face conferences and all these.
I see. Okay, well, I'm not sure the rest of the media would agree with you, but go ahead.
Yeah. The other question has to do, Minister, with respect to the deficit, to the 2023 deficit figure of 2.8% that's being estimated. That is likely to be somewhere around $4 to $5 billion TT.
If it comes to pass, yes. No, you see, hold on. That 2.8 is based on two factors, because I interrogated them on that, and I want to make a point now. I made the point tangentially before, but I need to make it more directly now. When a country engages in an Article 4 consultation with the IMF, it's part of an agreement. So you agree to do this. And they will look at your economy, they look at your fiscal situation, they look at your monetary policy, and they make recommendations. But when they finish the Article 4 consultation, you have a choice. It's within the rules. You can either publish their concluding statement, or It's not published. It's up to the country. So every single word in this IMF statement is something that we looked at and we decided we didn't have any violent objection to. I could have decided not to publish a statement, but as you will observe, I tried to give full exposure to everything. So I told the IMF, no problem. We will have publication of your concluding statement. And similarly with the Article 4 report, because the concluding statement is simply a summary of their observations and findings and recommendations. The report, which goes to the full board of the IMF, will be a far more detailed and far more comprehensive analysis of the Trinidad and Tobago economy and how the government is managing our finances. Again, countries can say, we don't want you to publish that. And there are several countries that just don't, because they don't want what is in the concluding statement or the Article 4 report to get out into the system. I've agreed to that as well. So I just want you to understand that a lot of what is in here, that is why I can answer you when you ask me the question about why is their calculation of the surplus different to mine. And I ask them. And then I say, no problem, go ahead, because this is your formula, this is your statement, go ahead and publish it. And I'm now able to explain, because I asked them, how come you came up with that? And what they do routinely, they told me, like a very conservative bank, I guess, if you're dealing with a commercial bank and you present your financials, the bank will look at extraordinary items of revenue, one-off items of income, and say, look, we're discounting that. And then we'll look at your maintenance income, the income that you can maintain going forward. So that I just wanted to make a point that everything inside of here is something that we have no violent objection to. Some of the things we're very happy that they have endorsed us, and some of the things we don't agree with them, and that has been our policy for the last 7 years. So perhaps now you could rephrase your question.
Hi, good afternoon, Minister. This is Suan Wayao from ACP News. I just have one question for you.
Sure.
You made a statement earlier that under this government, the IMF you all will not go into a program with the IMF. Can you explain the reasons as to why not? And if we do have to get into such a program, what would it mean for Trinidad and Tobago, which would basically justify your earlier statement? Thank you.
Certainly. Nobody wants to get into an IMF program. If one understands what the IMF is, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is the lender of last resort. Countries go to the IMF when they can't borrow from anybody else. So the international commercial banks won't lend them money. The domestic commercial banks won't lend them money. They're struggling to get money from the multilateral institutions because they're not happy with the conditions that might be imposed with those sources of funding. So when they have nowhere else to turn, nobody will lend them money to balance their budget, because it's also a country in distress. Whenever a country goes to the IMF, it's in distress. And quite often it's because they have a balance of payments crisis, and quite often they have a currency crisis. And I explained this the other day, and I want to explain it again. When one speaks about a currency crisis, one speaks about the fact that you have no foreign reserves. So a country might run out of foreign reserves. So instead of having 8 months cover as we have, they might have 1 month's cover, 1 week's cover. There are some countries, I'm told, that they count the amount of money they get every single day. And then when they figure out how much money they got today, they then decide what bills they're going to pay tomorrow. We are nowhere near there. So that we have absolutely no need to go to the International Monetary Fund. We have substantial financial buffers, as they are called. We have substantial reserves of foreign currency, which have stabilized in the $6.87 billion range now for the last 2 years or so. Our public debt has stabilized at about 129 billion, and our debt to GDP ratio is coming down. Our current account is in surplus. Our balance of payments is positive. So we don't need to go to the IMF, and it's the last thing a country would want to do. I gave the example of Jamaica. Being in an IMF program for over 40 years, being forced by the IMF as a conditionality to post a surplus. And by posting a surplus, they had to cut their expenditure and they had to reduce their expenditure on social programs. So one does not want to go there, and we have no intention of going there. Okay?
I believe Curtis had a supplemental question. Curtis, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, Minister, the same question about with respect to the debt. If the debt gets to that 2.8%.
Oh, yes. No, you're talking about the deficit.
Sorry, deficit. My apologies. Deficit.
Right. Let me explain. That's why I gave you the.
Let me ask the question.
Oh, go ahead.
Do you expect then to make changes with respect to the capital expenditure program?
Right. So what you are saying, your question is that if we run into trouble with our fiscal deficit, will we cut back on our capital expenditure program? The answer is no. Because all of the authorities, the IMF, the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, welcome expenditure on capital development. All of these entities are not favorably disposed to increasing expenditure on recurrent expenditure. As far as they are concerned, recurrent expenditure does not stimulate economic growth, does not create jobs, and does not stimulate economic activity, does not stimulate exports. But your capital program does that, because your capital program is infrastructure, it's highway infrastructure, it's projects, it's facilities, it's everything within the capital development program is designed to boost economic activity, improve the ease of doing business, and create jobs. So the answer is no, we would not cut back on capital expenditure at all. And in any event, we have managed significant deficits in the past, and my focus, and I saw Minister Dukaran talk about it recently, and he says this all the time, and I looked at what he said this time, and he said we should not be too worried about budget deficits, we should focus on growth, and my focus will be on growth. So even if we have to increase the deficit to maybe 2 billion or 3 billion, as the case may be, because that's just an estimate from the IMF, and it's extremely conservative. They're assuming the worst in terms of oil and gas prices and production and so on. They go to the extreme when they do the calculations. And that's why they were a bit upset that they had to come with a higher growth figure in 22 than us, because they're not supposed to do that. So we would not cut back on expenditure willy-nilly. We will try to maintain economic momentum, even if we have to have a higher deficit than we expected. Okay?
We have another question from Anthony Wilson. Anthony,
Sure.
go ahead.
Minister, the point 11 of the IMF concluding statement says, increasing the policy rate should be seriously considered to contain inflationary pressures and narrow the negative interest rate differentials with the U.S. monetary policy rate. This would also help mitigate potential risks of capital outflows, and it goes on.
Yeah, I read it. As I said, I reviewed the draft statement before it was published, and we are not violently opposed to this. The IMF is telling us we should consider, well, not telling us, telling the central bank, because they deal with interest rates, that they should seriously consider increasing the interest rate. And in the meeting, as I've said, and I'm repeating this, because perhaps you didn't hear me the first time, the governor of the central bank, when we dealt with this issue, when we were reviewing the statement, because we had a meeting to review, and the IMF will publish whatever it wishes to publish, because we can't tell them what to publish, but we can comment on their draft. And the governor was very emphatic in making the point that in Trinidad and Tobago, the central bank does not operate like the Federal Reserve in the United States. The Federal Reserve just increases interest rates, because that is what they have to do by law. Our central bank has no such legal restriction. So when they look at the economy, they look at it as a whole. So I am sure you know, Mr. Wilson, that if one were to increase interest rates in Trinidad and Tobago, it would stifle economic growth. I am sure you know that. And the other thing is, when one looks at the data, there is no capital flight occurring in Trinidad and Tobago. There is no risk-taking that we can see in the financial sector from the constant monitoring of the financial sector by the central bank. None of this is taking place. And the irony of this is that they published a statement before Credit Suisse almost collapsed. And Credit Suisse almost collapsed because of this policy of increasing interest rates. So this is a view coming out of North America that we simply do not agree with. Our central bank for the last 50 years has managed interest rates based on a multifaceted approach, looking at economic growth, looking at inflation, looking at job creation, and looking at maintaining economic momentum. And that is why, even though the IMF says this, we're not agreeing to this. I don't know whose agenda is here telling us that we must increase interest rates. I don't know if somebody wants to benefit from higher deposit rates. I don't know what the issue is, but we're not doing this. Because from the time you increase interest rates, that increases borrowing rates. Small businesses will suffer if they have to pay increased interest rates. It will cause them to reduce their profit margin, may even cause the collapse of certain small businesses. So the central bank is being very prudent and very careful and very sophisticated in the way it is dealing with interest rates, and I commend it. Kavita, how long have you
Do we have any other questions?
for about an hour?
Questions at this point.
Okay, I just want to thank everybody for.
I just have another question. Would you like to facilitate, Mr. Williams?
It is? Okay. This will be the last question.
Sorry. Yeah, my last question is it has to do with respect to the NIS situation.
Oh, Curtis, this is the last question, period. You see how lucky I am? Go ahead.
With respect to the NIS situation, where are you with respect to the consultations with stakeholders with, to move the retirement age to 65?
Consultations are being completed.
Right.
But, as expected, you have mixed reactions. The majority of the stakeholders are interested in it. Some of the trade unions are opposed to it, isn't it? And within the trade union movement, you have dichotomy because you have the NU, GFW demanding that the government make the retirement age 65 years across the board in the public sector. NU, GFW demands that loudly too. And then you have the PSA saying, don't touch it. Now, there are always arguments for and against increasing the retirement age. Some people will feel they are denied promotional opportunities, and when people reach 60, they should leave, so that it creates room for career movement. Other people will say, at 60 years old, they're still fit, they're still healthy, their brain's still working, and therefore they can make a contribution to society because of their tremendous experience. And for them to just leave the system and all of that institutional knowledge and experience and capability just disappear is not a good idea. And in any event, they can continue to contribute. They can continue to earn a much higher income because your pension is always less than your salary. So there's a whole body of people who welcome the idea of an increased retirement age because it means they can earn substantial income for longer and that they can contribute after the age of 60. You know, it all has to do with the development of the human body over time. You know, people work for much less in the past. People died at an earlier age. People were less productive at an earlier age before. Now you have people being productive into their 70s and into the 80s. Look, we just increased the retirement age for judges to 70. And I mean, you need to have a judge who is clear-headed, who is sentient, who is thinking, who can function, who is healthy and so on, but we made the decision to increase the retirement age for judges to 70. And in fact, I was in a meeting with the University of Trinidad and Tobago recently about a matter, and I found out that the retirement age for professors in UTT is now 70 years old. So that this requires some forward thinking. It requires people to think outside the box, and the majority of the stakeholders are of the view that we should increase the retirement age. But it's not something we'll jump into willy-nilly. But I'll tell you something. If it happens, and across it's happening throughout the region, you know, check the retirement age in Barbados, check the retirement age in Jamaica, 65, 66 in the public sector. All those countries, 65, 66 is the retirement age. If it happens, then there will be more contributions going into the National Insurance Fund, and the integrity of the fund will be strengthened. Okay? So thank you very much for that, and thank you all for attending this press conference. And I'd just like to say that it was important to have this press conference because a number of key stakeholders in the business community reached out to me to complain about the coverage given to the IMF concluding statement because they had read it for themselves and they saw out of the 20 points, 15 or more were extremely positive. And these stakeholders in the business community were concerned that instead of giving us a confidence boost, instead of making the country recognize and understand that we got a very positive report from the IMF, that some commentators felt that they had to focus on the negative and to distort and trivialize some of the issues. So I'm very glad for this press conference. Has given me this opportunity to give our side of the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
TTT News, delivering more news more often to more people. Follow us on social media at TTT Live Online. Log on to www.ttt.live.
The winning numbers in the National Lottery